There is a child on a street in Reykjavik, riding a bicycle past a row of low-painted houses. Her hair is the color of pale wheat, her eyes are a kind of glass blue, and if you saw her you would say, well, of course, that is what an Icelander looks like. That is what a Viking's daughter looks like. And you would be wrong. Not completely wrong, but wrong in a way that took 1,000 years to discover. Wrong in a way that the Icelanders themselves did not know, until the science arrived and quietly opened a door they had never thought to open. I want to tell you what was behind that door, because it is one of the strangest, saddest, most human stories I have ever come across. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Every face on that island, every name in that famously close-knit web of relatives, is the descendant of a meeting nobody recorded. A meeting that, in the official histories, never quite happened. Let me start where the legend starts. A little over 1,100 years ago, a Norwegian man named Ingolfur Arnarson stood at the edge of his ship and threw 2 carved wooden pillars into the cold sea. He had decided, with the kind of confidence that comes from being a Viking chieftain in the late 9th century, that wherever those pillars washed ashore was where he would build his life. He had fled Norway after a blood feud. He had crossed the North Atlantic with his family, his half-brother, and, according to the old chronicles, with slaves. Those last 3 words are not the part of the story Iceland prefers to tell. The pillars came ashore in a wide bay where the ground steamed from geothermal vents. He called the place Reykjavik, Smoky Bay. He built a farm, and in the decades that followed, somewhere between 8,000 and 20,000 Norse settlers crossed the same cold water and stepped onto the same black sand. They came in waves. They built farms. They wrote their names into a book called The Book of Settlements. That book is still here. You can read it. And if you are Icelandic, you can almost certainly trace your family back to a man inside it. Almost certainly a man. Hold on to that. For more than 1,000 years, that was the story Iceland told itself. We are the children of Norse pioneers. Our language is the closest living thing to Old Norse. Our sagas are the saga of a free people, on a hard island, descended from the bravest of the Vikings, who refused a king's rule and sailed for the edge of the world. That story was true, mostly, but it was missing something. It was missing nearly half of itself. I want to tell you when the cracks began to show. Around the year 2000, a small genetics company in Reykjavik, Decode Genetics, did something nobody had really done before. They looked at mitochondrial DNA, the kind that passes only from mother to daughter, an unbroken line of women going back through time. And what they found was simple and quiet and impossible to ignore. The women who founded Iceland were not Norse. Not all of them. Not even most of them. The majority of the founding mothers of Iceland came from Ireland and Scotland. Consider what that means. The men in Ingolfur's ship were Norse. The men who scratched their names into the Book of Settlements were Norse. The men whose Y chromosomes you can trace today still come back, around 3 times out of 4, to Norway and Sweden. But when you trace the women, the unbroken line of mothers and grandmothers and great-grandmothers, you cross a sea. You leave Scandinavia behind. You end up in the green hills of Ireland and the misty coasts of Scotland, in villages whose names we do not know, in a century where most of the world was illiterate, and you find women who had no idea that their daughters would one day build a country. How did they get there? This is the part of the story that I keep returning to, because the simple answer is that they were brought. The Norse word for what they were is thrael. It comes down to us, almost unchanged, as our word thrall. It means slave. In the late 700 and through the 800, Viking ships did not just sail past Ireland and Scotland. They landed, they burned monasteries, They emptied villages. And the most valuable thing they carried back was not silver. It was people. Women, mostly. Young women, mostly. They became cargo in a trade that stretched across all of Viking Europe, from Dublin to Constantinople. Some were sold, some were kept, some were married, in a kind of marriage that nobody in our time would call by that name. And some of them, when the Norse pushed further west, were put on ships and taken to an island in the middle of an empty sea where they would never see home again. We do not have their names. Not one. The Book of Settlements lists the men. The women, when they appear at all, appear as someone's wife, or someone's mother, or someone's slave. The histories were written by their captors and the captors' grandsons. Their stories were told only in their own breath, in their own arms around their own children, and then they died, and the breath went with them. But the DNA did not. The DNA waited. For 1,000 years it waited, copied from mother to daughter, line after line, generation after generation, until somebody finally thought to look. In 2018, a team at that same small company in Reykjavik did something that had been technically impossible until very recently. They dug up the bones of 27 Icelanders who had been buried during the first generations of settlement. They cracked open a tooth, they pulled DNA out of the enamel, and they sequenced, for the first time, the whole genomes of the people who actually founded Iceland. The lead author was a woman named Sunna Ebenesersdóttir. She was, in a sense, doing genealogy on her own ancestors, with a level of precision no genealogist before her had ever had. And what she and her team found, sitting in those bones, was the same story the mitochondrial DNA had whispered 18 years before, but now in full color. The founding population of Iceland was not Norse. It was not even mostly Norse. It was a mixed people, almost evenly split between the men who carried the swords and the women who had been carried. Now, here is the part that stayed with me. If you compare those ancient bones to a person walking through downtown Reykjavik today, the modern person is more Norse than the ancient one. Not by a little, by a lot. The Iceland of 1,000 years ago was something like 43 out of every 100 Gaelic. The Iceland of today is closer to 30. Somewhere between then and now, the Gaelic side of the story got quieter. That cooling was not a story of choice. It was not a story of intermarriage. It was a story of disease. In the early 1400s, a plague swept through Iceland and killed nearly half of everyone alive. Half. 3 centuries later, in the early 1700s, a smallpox epidemic killed more than a third. The population, which had once grown to 70,000, collapsed to 33,000. Then, a famine in the 1780s killed another fifth. The volcano called Laki erupted. The sky turned brown. The sheep died. The children died. And the old women who remembered the old stories died with them. When a population is small enough, random chance starts to do things that look like fate. A woman who had 10 surviving children might be a great-great-grandmother to 1,000 people 3 centuries later. A woman whose family caught the plague in 1403 might have no descendants at all. Geneticists have a name for this. They call it drift. And what drift did to Iceland over 1,000 years of plague and hunger was to slowly, randomly, mercilessly thin out lineages. Many of those that thinned were Gaelic. The Norse women who came to Iceland came mostly as wives. The Gaelic women, on the whole, did not. Slaves had harder lives. Slaves had fewer children, or had them in worse conditions, or saw more of them die. Even on the same island, eating the same food, in the same century, the line of a chieftain's wife and the line of a kidnapped girl from County Antrim did not roll forward at the same rate. Over 35 generations, The math does what math does. If you wanted to listen for a moment to my favorite finding from all of this, before we go any further, here it is. If you take the DNA of one of those ancient Icelanders, a person buried in 890-something in the first generation of the country, and you compare it against the modern population of Iceland, the modern population of Norway, and the modern population of Ireland, that ancient Icelander is not closest to the modern Icelanders. He is closer to the modern Irish and to the modern Norwegians than he is to his own descendants. Let that sit for a second. The people of Iceland have drifted away from themselves. The country has been so isolated, so battered by plague and famine, that its modern citizens are now further, genetically, from their own founders than the people in Dublin are. A young woman walking through Reykjavik today, who is Icelandic to the bone, who speaks the language that is closest of all to the language her ancestors spoke, is, by her DNA, more changed than the cousin she would have, 8 or 9 ancestors deep, in a pub in Galway. I find that almost unbearably moving. The blood remembered. The blood kept the line, but the line itself moved. If you have made it this far, and this is hitting you the way it hit me, stay with me. There is a part coming up I have not been able to stop thinking about. It has to do with what one of those founding women might have looked like, and what her grandchildren must have known about her, and what is still waiting in the ground, in the bays, in the long volcanic valleys that nobody has dug up yet. Here is the strange thing about silence. We do not have those women's names. We do not have their voices. We do not have a single line of poetry in their language from their lips. The sagas, those long, brilliant, strange medieval stories that Icelanders are famous for, were written down by the descendants of the men who took them. The Gaelic women appear, when they appear, in passing, as a slave who was freed, as a slave who poisoned her master, as a slave who escaped and was hunted across a moor with dogs, as the mother of a famous son. But we have something else. We have their bodies in the ground. We have their daughters' bodies. We have their daughters' bodies. And we have, in every Icelander alive today, somewhere between 1/5 and 1/3 of a genome that came not from a Viking ship, but from a Viking ship's prisoner. Every face on that island, every brilliant scientist, every fisherman, every musician, every politician, every child on a bicycle in Reykjavik with pale wheat-colored hair. They are not the children of conquerors. They are the children of conquerors and the women the conquerors took, and the math of 1,000 years has not been able to subtract that. The women got the last word by simply being there, by having daughters, by those daughters having daughters, by the unbroken silent line of mitochondria passed cell to cell to cell until it ended up in a tooth that a scientist could crack open and read. Now, there is one part of this story that I want to be honest about, because the honesty is part of why this discovery is moving. We still do not know exactly how many of them came as captives, and how many as something more like free settlers, and how many as something we do not have a clean word for. There are accounts in the old texts of Gaelic women who arrived with status of their own, who married into Norse families on equal footing, who had servants. Not every Gaelic woman in early Iceland was a slave. The genetic record can tell us the women came. It cannot tell us, one by one, under what conditions each of them stepped off the boat. But here is what we can say. The asymmetry is real. The men were Norse, and the women, in disproportionate numbers, were not. That kind of imbalance, many fathers from one country, many mothers from another, separated by a sea, does not happen by accident. It happens because power and violence and the slave trade pulled women out of one country and dropped them into another. And it happened so widely and so consistently that you can still read it in a vial of saliva in a lab 1,100 years later. That is the discovery in the end. Not just that Icelanders are part Gaelic. The Irish suspected as much for generations, and so did anyone who looked carefully at the old texts. The real discovery is that the silence was not silence. The discovery is that the women who were never written down, never named, never given a saga, never given a poem, were still here. They were inside the people of the island the whole time. I keep thinking about that child on the bicycle. She is, in some statistical, mathematical sense, 1 part Norway and 1 part Norwegian sea, and 1 part Irish hillside, and 1 part Scottish coast, and 1 part plague survivor, and 1 part famine survivor. Every part of her is the residue of 1,000 years of choices, most of them not made by her ancestors, who were not in a position to make any choices at all. And she does not need to know any of this to be who she is. The DNA does not whisper its history. The DNA just is. It writes the eye color and the height and the slow biochemistry of an ordinary morning, and it carries forward the people who carried it forward, and it does not care whether their names were ever written down. But we can care. That is what this discovery to me is really about. It is not about pure ancestry or contaminated ancestry or any of those poisonous old ideas. It is about the way history forgets the powerless and the way the body remembers anyway. The Vikings wrote the books. The Vikings wrote the sagas. The Vikings carved the names into the stones. And then, 11 centuries later, a small team in Reykjavik cracked open a tooth, and the body said, quietly, "I was here too. I am still here. I am the woman you did not write down. Look at your country. Look at your daughter. Look at her face. I am everywhere in it." So, if you are ever in Reykjavik, and you see a young person on a bicycle riding past a row of painted houses with pale wheat-colored hair and glass blue eyes, do not look at her and think, Viking. That is the easy story. That is the story the men wrote about themselves. Look at her and think of 2 countries. Think of a long ship and a stolen room on a dark sea. Think of a woman who could not write her own name in a book, but whose name was written instead into her daughter, and her daughter's daughter, and her daughter's daughter's daughter, all the way down the long, thin line of women, mother to mother to mother, until it arrived, intact, at a child on a bicycle, riding past the painted houses on a quiet street, on an island at the edge of the world that we used to think we understood. We did not understand it. We are starting to now. And the story it has been waiting all this time to tell us is not the story of the Vikings. It is the story of the women they took.